on the front line. So the population was very pro-South, but also when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. The minister here, his name was Ambler. His house is, and his old house you can see in Jamestown. But the minister here was very pro-South. He got up and made some very nasty remarks about the whole thing, about the Emancipation Proclamation. And the military governor came in and told them, congregation, you're welcome to hold church service here so long as you pray for President Lincoln. And they wouldn't do it. Okay.
So they said
after that, they would not pray for President Lincoln. So they were no longer allowed to have regular church services here. They did hold him in the minister's house out in the countryside a little bit. But for the rest of 1863, church was not held here except when the military chaplain ran regular Protestant services, mainly for the Union troops. But there was 1 year here that they did not hold services, and that was the year that they set free slaves.
Did they lift that ban after that year then?
They let them have they kept their mouth shut after that, and they were allowed to come back. But do you come from around here?
No, from California.
Then you should see, one of the places you should see, there was a big Union fort, Fortress Monroe, at the other end of this peninsula, down in Hampton, which I just was down there 2 weeks ago. It's huge. It's got a
There's
moat.
40 people
we're talking about
that are underneath the building of this church,
and it is really
and they
cool.
keep the walls high because they were talking about how cold it would get, and then they would have little heaters, little lanterns heaters there.
Slaves from up further north just started moving across the line as fast as they could and moved further south into the peninsula. By the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, the whole southern end of this, not on that map, we're talking about the big peninsula, 40, maybe 30 miles, okay? The south end of this peninsula was packed with runaway slaves by 1863. And the southern guys demanded that they be returned back and to their masters or compensated. And the military governor in charge of the fort down there, he said, you consider slaves to be property, and one of the there were laws about returning runaway slaves, right? Yes. But he says, since you all consider them to be property, there's another law that says in war, any property can be considered contraband, therefore helpful to the enemy, and therefore can be confiscated. So all of the slaves who were run away, they were simply given a little thing saying that they were contraband property and therefore had the right to be free. And so everybody on the south end, all down towards what's now Hampton and Newport News, was packed with runaway slaves who were all given their freedom by the simple fact that they were able to escape the southern occupation.
That they played
exactly. Well, there were a lot of loopholes, and a lot of smuggling through here. For example, because Williamsburg was right on the line, they had problems here with smugglers, but they had problems keeping things under control. But Yorktown, which is halfway between here and Hampton, had a regular U.S. post office. If mail from Richmond could be smuggled through the line and sent out at a regular American post office in either Hampton or Yorktown, it could go anywhere in the world. It could go anywhere in the north, anywhere overseas, because it was run an American post office. And so this was an important place for smuggling during that time. But it's an important place for slaves too, because they were trying to get down into this area where they.
Do you know anything about the Underground Railroad system? Was that happening in this area as well?
The Underground Railroad was mostly further inland. Here, there were pockets. For example, the whole eastern shore of Virginia, there's two counties, the south end of Delmarva Peninsula, they were never taken by the South. The people were all pro-South, but they were held because the Union knew that keeping Chesapeake Bay open was important for ships going to Baltimore and Washington and so on. So they held on to pockets. People who lived along the shore, if they could make it to pockets of Union occupation, then they were free. So the people, the Underground Railroad mainly ran along like the Shenandoah Valley or up along the mountain front, Charlottesville, up through that way, going up towards.
Again, can you explain that section over there with the balcony? You said that's where the slaves.
This balcony was built specifically for black people in 1852. And from that point on, black people were not down here on the main floor, but on the other hand, there weren't very many black members back at that point anyway.
Right.
And I'll tell you, you asked about where this information comes from. Our local newspaper goes back to 1738, I think it is, 1738, the Virginia Gazette. And although the records have a lot been destroyed, we have newspapers going from every single week all the way back to 1738. And if you go to the Carter Museum, which, Rockefeller Museum, which is across the tracks over here, you can open up the old books and read all the newspapers and who were seated there in 1852. Yeah.
1952. Wow.
That is
We've got a lot of information here.
Yes.
So another question for you. The place that we were at, the building over here, was the kind of the community center. All right. So at some point in time, they had a
Hold on.
7-year rule.
So Dougie's gonna ask a question.
Law that stated that after 7 years or so they would get their freedom, even if they were slaves, or
That's-
they were
that
indentured
was the
servants,
indentured
so to
servant
speak.
thing.
So my
I hope
question
you're not going to put
was,
this on television or something.
we hope so. Well, at some point in time, they were allowed to be freed because they were just indentured slaves.
At the beginning,
So my
at the
question
very
was,
beginning,
is it-
you see, the English people did not have experience with slavery. And so it became the norm to just, I mean, what are we going to do with people? They captured a Spanish ship and captured the slaves that were on it. It was an English ship, the White Dove, something like that, White Swan. Anyway, they captured these slaves and brought
White
them-
horse.
Pardon?
White horse. I was reading up the other.
I
I was looking up that, reading
They
something.
brought them here, and yes, they were sold, but so were indentured people sold. White people from England were brought here indentured. They had no money to pay. So
Right.
the
So
idea
that was
was,
their way
you get here, we put you up for sale, somebody buys you, and they pay us, they pay the ship, okay, and the owner of the ship, and maybe even a little extra for the company in London that sent them. But they will then be able to work off their indenture over 7 years, and then after that, they're a free person. Most of them didn't survive that long. The vast majority of people die. In the first 15 years or so here, most of the people died within a year or two of their arrival here. The diseases and stuff, they just weren't used to.
But they
the
were not
climate.
afraid. They were captured as
I'm
kidnapped.
talking about either white or black people. They
Right.
both died.
Just dying.
They simply died. In fact, it's very interesting if you look at the numbers, because up till about 1620, far more people arrived than were living here in 1620. I mean, it was like something like 4 or 5 to 1 for every. 4 died for every one that managed to survive to 1620. It was a huge death rate. But anyway, my point is that up until the time of the English Civil War, black people here were basically treated as indentured servants.
And then
After
they
the
worked their
English
way out.
Civil War, things went downhill and slavery was legally introduced because the Cavalier class, the high Anglicans, very pro-Catholic group takes power in England, and they ran the government. Charles II.
And they decided we're going to do the slavery thing.
Yeah, they basically, yeah. Well, I'll tell you another thing about slavery that hardly anybody knows, and that is, are you really interested in all this?
Yes, we are of that people. So.
Okay, I'm sure, well, I've never talked to anybody, I take that back, I knew one lady, I met one lady in here, a guy named Lord Mansfield. In the English government, up until 2002, they had no Supreme Court. The House of Lords, the upper house of Parliament, was considered the Supreme Court of the country. And so any issues that were legal were eventually brought to the House to make decision. In 1773, a slave from Jamaica was brought to England. And after he was there for 6 months or so, the slave master wanted to take him back to Jamaica. And the guy sued the slave master, saying that he now lived in England, therefore he was free, simply because England did not legally have slavery. And this eventually worked its way up to the House of Lords, and the head of the House of Lords, as far as the legal part of it went, was a Lord Mansfield. I think his real name was Murray, something like that. But anyway, Lord Mansfield heard the case and decided in favor of the slave. Okay, he said that and it's a long quote that English people occasionally quote, and it has to do with the air of England is too pure to allow for the curse of slavery on our soil. Something along that line, okay? And so he sided with the slave and set him free. Parliament refused to recognize his decision, and they refused until later in the 1800s, when you have the stories about Newman and so on in England about how slavery finally came to an end in England. But it was on the books, at least from 1773, it was on the books that slaves in England, that the Constitution, the unwritten Constitution of England did not allow for slavery. The word of that reached America by the end of 1773. And all of a sudden, you have a huge shift in Southern politics. Before that time, they could have cared less what was going on up in Massachusetts and Connecticut and all that place. All of a sudden, they realized that if the English government can set slaves free in England, they can do the same thing in America, because they're the dominant thing. And suddenly, it's interesting, because people who have studied this have shown that the white people here in the South refused to put it in the newspapers because they didn't want anybody to read about it. But the word of mouth was spread that the slaves were being set free in England, even though it didn't quite happen that way. But the word of mouth was the slaves were being set free in England. And all of a sudden, the South rallies to poor Boston, and the Boston Tea Party and all those kind of things, which they had cared nothing about before, it now becomes #1 on their agenda, because they were scared to death that all the slaves in the South were going to be set free by the British government.
They tried to pull the attention to something else?
No, they simply sided with the revolutionists up in Massachusetts. And they had been tended to be pro-British before that time. And so you now have a huge shift in how the South saw things, and that, in long term, since the last battle of the Revolution was here in Yorktown, probably lent to the American Revolution. But it was a legal matter that becomes important in American government that nobody in America ever heard of.
I see.
So I have a question.
Yep. Graves under the floor. Is that your question?
No, not the grave. 1865, before Lincoln's death.
Yep.
He had an arrangement with General Sherman. It's called Order 15. In Order 15, they were told the African Americans were going to get a mule and 40 acres.
Yep.
Do you have any history on that one? Do you have any knowledge on that one?
My only comment on that is Lincoln died. And
Right.
It just didn't happen because you had two groups. We actually just one big group. I mean, in the election of 1844, there were a lot of people that didn't particularly agree with Lincoln, but the American government, just like the British government that I was telling you about, refused to go along with that. I mean, they didn't like the new vice president who now becomes the president, and they simply weren't going to do that. And
so what happened was Lincoln was a Republican, and as you know, Republicans and the radical Republican, but Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat, was the vice president. So when Lincoln died, everything, instead of the slaves were free, but they didn't acquire the land and they didn't get the mules because Andrew Johnson reverted the land back to the slave owners. Now the slave owners did get reparations and they got paid and compensated. It's a compensation act that the government passed, and they were being able to be paid for their slave. But the most turning part of American history.
Are you reading this?
No, I'm not reading anything.
Oh, okay.
I know this by heart.
Okay.
The most turning point about American history is that in 1877, the radical Republicans were fighting against Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson was one of the worst presidents in U.S. history for me because of what he did for black people. I didn't think he did not help black people.
No, Andrew Johnson only served out Lincoln's term.
Right.
Not 1877.
1877 was Hayes. And because of Hayes, the Union pulled out of the South.
Yeah.
And
that was a political deal.
That was a political deal, which messed up the African Americans. because
That's true.
because what they did was we were no longer protected.
That's true.
So then a thing called social Darwinism came into place. And social Darwinism was a law that Darwinism, I'm saying it wrong. So it became the new Jim Crow. I'm sure you know what Jim
Social
Crow.
Darwinism doesn't have anything specifically to do with Jim. Social Darwinism has to do with whether or not all people are equal in
That's
capability.
correct. That's correct.
Okay, and that has nothing particularly to do with the laws, because if you have prejudiced people, they don't care what the law is.
Right.
They're just going to use things for justification.
But social Darwinism.
Well, I'd just as soon not talk about things after the Civil War, because I think things went, I mean, in many ways, our problems today go back to exactly the same time. And
Right.
we have the same kind of,
Right. But
people
to
in some-
deny what happened after the Civil War would be wrong for the next generation of history, because my understanding of social Darwinism is
Yeah, but it's-
one being feels that they are the superior being. So white people at that time felt that they were the superior being. So
they felt that all the way back.
right, of course. And so they use more of the premise of that to execute the next level of what we call Jim Crow and redlining. I mean, that was part of the foundation. And like you said, of course you had racism all through the South.
Well, you're
I
talking
felt-
to the choir. I agree with you totally,
Oh.
but I don't particularly want, I don't. Well, let me tell you this. I have lived in Africa twice. I love Africa. I was in the Peace Corps in Kenya. I learned to speak Swahili. I liked Africa so much I went back for a year to teach school there, okay? But I will say this, that black people in America and black people in Africa are not the same. And it has nothing to do with their color. It's got to do with their culture.
Absolutely.
Okay? And so I have a degree in anthropology and a degree in history. And I would just as soon not comment on that. What you're saying is absolutely true. Okay, but in both cases, it has to do with culture. It has to do with black culture and how they reacted to this, what happened after the Civil War, and it has to do with white culture and how they reacted after the Civil
agree.
War. We're just going to clamp down on everything, and we're not going to have anything good. And it doesn't just has to do with science, has to do with medicine, has to do with everything. Everything that was progressive and improving things, forget that. We're just going to try to keep things exactly as they were. And I don't believe in that at all.
No.
I don't believe in that at all.
So I'm able to trace my ancestors back to 1810.
Yep.
I'm what they call today, the new term so that you know, it's called ADOS, African American or American Descendant of Slaves. So that goes back to 1619 as you were speaking of. So this year is the 400th anniversary where we're celebrating the commencement of those 400 years.
Yep.
And so when we talk about the culture, you're right on point. I believe the African American immigrant who comes here today is a much different culture than the African American, or even Jamaican, or anybody from Trinidad, or any of those islands are much different than the African Americans today.
And they have cultural problems getting along with other people here.
Yes.
They do. There's no doubt about it. I taught school, and I had students from Trinidad and so on, and they were picked on, to be honest, by the other students. And I thought, this is totally unfair. And so that's one of the reasons I don't get involved in that discussion, because I'm a pretty good observer of cultures, and I certainly think that, well, no, I won't say that. I was going to say, I have real difficulty with American culture, okay, just in general. When people start going on about this is the best place and so on, they've never lived any other place.
Right.
They've lived in 10 foreign countries. I cannot, to say that Americans are better than others, I don't.
But if you talk about the Africans and the African American culture, right now we have immigration, illegal immigration, and then we come upon the Black American, who right now in California we're down to 6%. There are no more African Americans in California like there used to be.
That's because the Mexicans are taking over with
Right.
the same cultural niche. Okay, that's true.
And why do you think that came about? What is your opinion? I have my own, but what is your opinion?
that's plain old demographics. When people move into certain areas,
They worship you.
they want all the stuff that other people have.
Right.
And so
They worship here, but we don't.
I
But this is.
by the way, I want you to know this also. I don't represent the church. I didn't even-
No. This is more. This is our opinions. This is
okay.
is this-
Because I don't go to church here.
okay.
But I love being a history tour guide.
Oh, I love history. That's why I love talking to you about it. So this is my opinion. This is my opinion. I believe that America is divided in major points of history. One was when Lincoln died and when Andrew Johnson took over. And when we as Americans, when Andrew Johnson took over, the Reconstruction never was constructed the way the radical Republicans wanted and Lincoln wanted. It became more of the way of a combination of the Dixiecrats with Andrew Johnson, the radical Republicans were fighting, and the conservative Republicans that were fighting. And they continued to fight until Hayes got into office, and they said, look, we're just going to pull out of the South, and the Negroes were unprotected. But I also believe another turning point for the black.
There's a reason for that.
Okay, yeah.
Do you know the?
No,
it
I would
has
love to
do with
hear.
The election.
Right,
Because
right,
The election.
right,
Something
yes.
like 3 or 4 contested states, and it was just like we've had so many contested
Right.
elections lately.
It was a barter that they did with Hayes.
Well, that was the deal.
Right.
We will count these states.
Right.
Republicans
Understand that.
If you allow our guy to become the president.
But I'm sharing, and I agree with you. We're not
The
disagreeing.
results, you're absolutely right. The results ended up showing people, but I don't think it started then. I think it goes all the way back to people like Jefferson. Those guys, you read what those people, Jefferson and some of the people who are buried here, had to say about slavery and so on. They knew it was wrong, but they didn't have the guts to change it. Okay, that's where I see the problem to be. They simply didn't have guts enough to say, well, we're going to stand by what we know to be true. And that's, to be honest, in a sense, one of the things about living in a place like Williamsburg, where you really get to know stuff in history, is that you realize that these people were very fallible people who
Let
made
me ask you this. Are you
errors.
familiar with the Freedmen Bureau?
Yeah.
Okay. What's your take on this? The Freedmen Bureau, because they didn't get the 40 acres and their mule, and they voted in the fact that let's just create this bank and have all these black people put their money in that bank. Are you familiar with the
I don't
bank?
want to discuss anything since the Civil War.
Really?
No. I have strong opinions about those kind of things either, but I think that's.
No, but I don't know. I want to know your
The
opinion.
Freedmen's Bureau is a great idea, but on the other hand, I know people who think that Abraham Lincoln was struck down by God so that all of this would happen.
Ooh, that's
Okay?
interesting.
I mean, if Abraham Lincoln had been able to do his thing the way he wanted to, we wouldn't have any of these problems. But all of a sudden here the war ends and 3 days later he's dead. Okay? Now there are people around here who think that that was the hand of God and it all turned out the way God wanted it to be. I don't think that, but there are a lot of people who think that. Okay? So when you start pointing to certain events and saying this happened, this happened, this happened, Freedmen's Bureau and things like that were just sort of along the way. No, I think the problems go back to the revolution. They should have stuck with right instead of compromising all the 3/5 compromise and this other and that other compromise. Forget all those compromises. We ought to have a national convention and redo the whole works.
Right now, do you feel that way? Yeah.
I feel that way.
I appreciate that. I appreciate
Needless
that.
to say, I would never vote for who's in office now.
I'm gonna